Hey everyone, I'm Jason McKnight, and I'm glad you're here. I'm in the studio with Justin Tilghman, Dr. Justin Tilghman.
Oh, yeah.
What's going on today, Justin?
Nothing much, man. Just glad to be here.
Well, it's fun to be on Encounter Grace, and here's why. Because the whole point of Encounter Grace, the podcast, is to help thinking Christians live in the world and see where God is at work in this world for our good. I mean, this is what we're all about. And so if you've clicked on this link, it's because you saw the title. Unless it's just in your feed and you're listening to the next thing, which we also love. But the title of this episode, this one and next podcast is Trauma is Bigger Than You Think, But Smaller Than You Fear. Trauma is bigger than you think, but smaller than you fear. We're going to talk 2 days here on what trauma is, what are the types of trauma, and here's what we're going to discover. We all have it.
Yeah.
We've all experienced and endured trauma. And yet, it's smaller than you fear. So it's bigger than you think in that it's universal, but it's smaller than you fear in that it does not have to define you. Exactly. It's not the biggest thing about you as a believer, but even as someone who hasn't yet trusted Christ. So really, we're going to talk about how to deal with and cope with and heal from and process through different experiences that are not the way God intended them to be. Because, God doesn't invite trauma. I mean, that's not his intention for the universe. So the other thing, I think, just before we throw it over to you, Justin, while I go catch a nap. The other thing is that when I hear the word trauma, I think of it in the sense of the emergency room and the trauma center or something like that.
Which is probably what most people think of when you say the word.
Yeah. But actually, you're going to invite us into a slower burn or a longer term thing that it is not. It can be moments that punch you in the gut, but it can also be waves that come. Yeah. And so, what does that look like, and how do we need to process that and heal from it and think about it? Really, we want to give everyone a vocabulary to start their processing.
Yeah, because I mean, if you don't put a name to it, a lot of times you can't address it. So if you're not aware, that's the first step. And so, that's the hope today, is to give people a vocabulary and a framework to put traumatic experience in and the process of healing through that and not letting it become a part of who you are in terms of defining your identity. Yeah.
Justin, when you say if you don't put a name to it, have you named your trauma Jason?
Yeah, actually. Yeah, I have.
No, I'm just kidding. All right, well, why don't we do this? We're going to go in 4 major sections, and the first one will be really fast, but we're going to define what trauma is, and so we're going to talk about that. Then we're going to talk about types of trauma and really look at 4 types of trauma. And then we're going to look at the results of trauma, what it can do to you or does do to you. And then the last thing, somewhere in the next episode, we're going to talk about some practical tools to begin walking. Now, listen, there is a reason there are counselors and therapists, as well as spiritual directors, as well as shepherds and pastors, because 1 or 2 episodes on a podcast is not going to solve all the trauma in your life. But back to your naming it, if we never give a vocabulary to it, if we never think about it, we're going to have a hard time knowing that we're carrying it around, knowing that that's normal, and knowing that actually God invites us into healing some pretty interesting ways, those practical tools at the end.
Yeah, and I think as we talk through the types of trauma, that will also lend itself to, certain types of trauma require very intense, specialized work.
Yeah.
Some types of trauma can be dealt with at I won't say surface level, but a higher level than having to go super deep. And so when we say the word trauma, most people think of, like you mentioned, that one traumatic experience that was just awful. And that is one type of trauma. And that type of trauma often requires a lot of unpacking and perhaps some professional help. But not every type of trauma necessarily requires that level of help to begin to process it and move through it. So I'm hoping that's what we can leave folks with today too, is that there's more than one way to begin addressing your thought life and your experiences. And
Yeah. Now, Justin, one more thing before we define trauma. Why are you doing this?
I'm doing this
because of all the trauma in your life.
Yeah, of all the trauma. Yeah,
all the healing.
I encountered it a lot as I was doing life and leadership coaching. In the coaching space, a lot of times people call it limiting beliefs, and that's a lot of what some of this stuff is it's those thoughts of, well, I'm not good enough, or I always fail. And when we get into the definition of what trauma is, like we wouldn't normally consider those traumatic,
right?
But they're birthed out of some sort of trauma. And so as I was working with coaching clients and just people in general, just walking through life with other people, also having dealt with my own issues of anxiety and things like that, having a framework to begin to describe what was going on. Because for me, when I began to look at it as, okay, well, this might be a type of trauma, well, then that opened up a whole new toolbox for me of ways to start processing it and moving through it. And not all of it required deep counseling or therapy. Some of it just required conversation with another person, but the vocabulary I had now framed that conversation. And so
very good.
I think that's helpful when we say give people a vocabulary. When you can name something, it's just like any other, when the doctor can name what the diagnosis is, then we know what the treatment plan is. It's kind of the same thing here. If you can start to put a name to it, then you can develop a plan to address
G.I. Joe was right when I was a kid. Knowing is half the battle.
Yeah.
Let's get to it. Well, let's get to the definition of trauma.
Yeah. So how I think it's helpful for us to define trauma is to broaden it beyond just that one event. But if you see trauma as a twisting or disruption of God's good intention, and it's that point at which evil or sin enters into what God has ordered or intended. And so that can certainly fit what we think of as a traumatic experience, whether that's physical abuse, verbal abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, whatever. That fits into that category.
That's for sure.
But this also expands our category to be able to talk about trauma of absence, which we'll talk about in just a minute, or a trauma of comparison or trauma of perception, which are all types of trauma that oftentimes we don't discuss because we think so narrow focused on, well, I didn't have any bad event happen in my life. And you might not have, but you live with humans. So you live with human parents who are not perfect. You relate to people who are not perfect. And everybody has some mixture of, because we live in a fallen world, some twisting or disruption of God's good intention in our life. And for some people it's bigger, for some people it's smaller, but it still has an impact on the way that you relate to other people and even relate to yourself and arguably relate to God. So, it gets at the core of, and we'll talk about this a little bit later on, like just our attachment with other people, our attachment with God. That's one of the things that trauma impacts is how we feel when we think of another person or when we think of God. So if you expand your definition of trauma beyond just a singular bad event,
right,
you can have things like trauma of comparison or absence or perception, which, as you were mentioning earlier, are more like the constant waves crashing on the shore. And those waves erode the beach. And that's what happens here is you get these constant waves, and it's not as traumatic as a one-time event, but the effect over time is still similar.
Right. So, that's very good. So a twisting or a disruption of God's good intentions for our lives, or God's good intentions in our lives, which is great because it puts God back on in it, and he's got a way for us to flourish. And his intention for the world, the universe, humanity is flourishing. And because we live in a fallen world and under the curse and with sin and the fear of death, there is a twisting and a disruption. And what we're seeing for the purposes of today, to give us a vocabulary, is, well, let's call this trauma. And trauma isn't just being mugged on the street, but it can also be many other things. Now let's move into those. The types of trauma. You have already mentioned traumas of absence and traumas of comparison and traumas of perception. What do you mean by those? And maybe remind us of the trauma we all think about, and what is that, the fourth type?
Yeah, so these four categories, I can't take credit for them.
Oh, man.
I wish. But they come from the work of Dr. Jim Wilder, Dr. Marcus Warner, and they do a lot of work in this space. But they note 4 types of trauma. And so trauma A is the trauma of absence. And that's just simply the absence of good things.
Okay. A for absence.
Yeah, A for absence.
I gotcha.
And so something as simple as an absence of nurturing or safety or shelter. So think of things like neglect. If you had parents who were emotionally unavailable, or you have a partner who's emotionally unavailable, lack of affirmation for some people. And so it's not necessarily anything being done to someone, more as it's something not being done for someone.
And extreme poverty.
Yeah.
Like there's a huge...
Yeah, and it has a traumatic impact on you. So this leads to things like feelings of unworthlessness, or unworthiness, abandonment issues, relationship difficulties. All those things stem from that. I think a good example of this would be, let's say you have a young woman who doesn't receive warm love and affection from her father or whoever the primary male role model was in her life. And that absence of trauma could lead her to maybe either distrust men or to cause her to continuously seek out the approval of men because she's trying to fill an absence of something. And when we say trauma, that's a twisting of God's good intention, because God's intent is that we would not be without any of these things.
Yeah.
And so when they're not there,
right,
it twists what God intended. And so when you don't receive that, it's going to impact your ability to have loving relationships with other people because you're missing a piece.
Yeah.
And the way this works is if you don't fill that gap, which we'll talk about when we talk about ways to respond and process, if you don't fill that gap, it perpetuates to the next generation.
Yeah.
And not because it's necessarily a quote unquote bad thing, but because it's a skill you weren't modeled or wasn't modeled for you, so you don't have it to give.
Right.
And so that is the trauma of absence, something that should have been there but wasn't, and oftentimes either impacts our attachment to people, impacts our ability to feel a sense of value and worth because our brain almost feels programmed to feel abandonment. And certainly there's a spectrum to all of these types of trauma. Like I don't want to put them all in one box. There's a spectrum to all of these, but that's the general idea of a trauma A.
Well, and part of my story is losing my dad at 10, and that's a trauma of absence.
Yeah.
I mean, it felt like a gut punch, so maybe it's a trauma of presence, of death in the household that shouldn't have been there. But over time, I didn't have a dad to go to ask this, that, and the next thing, or to discipline. And my poor mom's on her own disciplining us. That didn't, so imagine disciplining 5 kids at once. Yeah. But anyway, and a lot of moms do it, or a lot of dads do it, single parent homes. So what you're saying, and where do you look for love and approval and affection and security? I mean, this actually is probably the most widespread of the traumas, but we don't think of it. We don't think
exactly.
Of that.
Yeah. Yeah. I think especially A, and when we talk about trauma C and trauma P, I think those 3 are a lot more prevalent
than we realize,
which is why we expand the definition of what trauma is. And I don't want people leaving this thinking, well, if I'm not perfect for my kids, then they're going to be traumatized the rest of their life. That's not what we're saying.
Well, they're going to be anyway.
The world's going to traumatize them in some way, but I think that's some of what we need to do is take the fangs out of this word trauma to where all we think about is, well, I've never been physically abused, or I've never think about, and when you think about trauma as a twisting of something good, then we've all experienced that.
Yeah.
And trauma just simply means it has an impact on us.
Twisting of God's good intention imposed on us. So I didn't ask not to have a dad at home, and it was imposed on me. And so I had to deal with it.
But I think it's helpful too, because it identifies this as a real problem. Like if you didn't have a dad at home, that's not how God intended things. And so you need to understand that does have an impact on you. Yeah. And the more we are able to verbalize that and communicate that, again, it does not mean we're weaker. It does not mean any of that. Yeah. It just simply helps define how we're thinking and how we're viewing the world and how we're interacting with the world. And those things do have a part to play. And when they're not there, you have a trauma occur.
Yeah. Well, then number B or trauma B is the simplest one. The bad things that happen.
Yeah, that's the one when we say the word trauma, that's what people think about is something harmful or an abusive event that happens. It's physical abuse, verbal abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, and that leads to fear, mistrust, anxiety. Yeah, I think we're all pretty familiar with trauma B.
Yeah,
and
that's what we think of.
Yeah, what it does to us.
Yeah.
Even though it happened in the past, it still impacts your present. And depending on how deep these are, it can take a while to heal from some of this, and it can take some intense work. But I think that's the point that we need to get across, people, is that healing can occur.
Yeah.
It just, depending on where you are on the trauma spectrum, it could take longer. And none of the stuff we're going to talk about today is a silver bullet for anything. It's just a tool in the tool belt to help you begin to process what you have experienced or what you're currently experiencing, because trauma is not just in your childhood. You can have traumatic events even today.
So let's just do this then. Let's summarize A and B: the absence of things that should have been there and the presence of things that shouldn't have been there.
That's a good way to put it.
And both of those are real in our lives. By the way, if you are currently experiencing verbal abuse or emotional or psychological abuse or physical abuse or sexual abuse, that's not your fault, and you don't need to stay in that. Do not let someone tell you that to be a good wife or a good husband or a good daughter or a good son, you can't make waves. There is no room in God's economy for abusive behavior. So if you're experiencing that, come and talk to us at Grace. We want to help you into reality and into healing. So the bad things that shouldn't be there, trauma B, and then the good things that weren't there, trauma A. Well, let's go on to comparison and perception. 2 more traumas that are new to me, honestly.
Yeah, and they were new to me. And so I would definitely, I feel confident saying these next 2, you probably haven't ever considered to be trauma before. So trauma C is the trauma of comparison. And so wounds of comparison are very painful, but they're very subtle. And I think that's one of the reasons it doesn't get the attention that trauma B necessarily gets, because we can't see these as much. And what this simply is when you are comparing yourself to other people and outlining the ways you don't measure up to whatever the standard is that they have or that you have on them. So let's say an example of, you've got, 2 sisters, one's more attractive than the other. And the guys always want to come up to this one girl and say, hey, can you put in a good word with your sister? And that's all they ever want to talk to her about. So she's constantly comparing herself to herself to her sister, and she's not measuring up. And so there come the feelings of inadequacy, and there's this void. Why don't people appreciate me? Why is it all about her? And every time it's about her, it's her look. So I must not measure up. And so then I'm going to begin to, or she's going to begin to live in such a way where she can alleviate that pain or address it. And so that could look like difficult relationships or not having a relationship at all. And so that's just that simple comparison game. And we think it's harmless, but our self-talk impacts us. And so when we're constantly looking at other people and I'm not as successful as her, or I'm not as smart as he is, what we're telling ourselves is, well, you're not enough. And so you've got to do this or do that or not do this or not do that so that you will be enough. Or you've got to put a shield up to protect yourself because you're not enough. And so leads to perfectionism. I've got to have it all right. I can't ever mess anything up. And
can't rest.
And if I do mess something up, then it becomes an existential crisis, because now my identity is wrapped around how I'm comparing myself to other people. And tell me that's not traumatic.
Yeah, right.
But it's not a punch to the face.
So when does it go from a bad habit to trauma? Because we all kind of look, I wish I could have a beard like you.
Yeah.
But that's
I
not
wish
traumatic.
I could have hair like you. So
There we go. So here we go. But like that's not trauma then, I guess, if I fixate on it.
Yeah. And I would say that you cross the line when this becomes an ingrained thought pattern. And so the playful self-deprecation, that's okay. But
we need that for humility.
Yeah, when it becomes the overarching narrative in your mind most of the time, then that's a good indicator that it's crossed the line from just kind of being playful to now it's impacting how you're interacting with people and with the world around you.
Of course they treat you that way. You're the ugly sister or you're the dumb brother or whatever. Yeah, I got you.
And that's really closely related to trauma P, which is trauma perception. And I think these two really go together. And that is just trauma based on how events are perceived. I can't remember who said this, but I thought it was so helpful. our emotions respond. We hear that term, perception is reality. And that's not true. Reality is reality.
Right.
But our emotions respond to perception. And so my emotions aren't responding to the reality around me. They're responding to the way I'm perceiving what's going on around me.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you're misinterpreting criticism or negative feedback as a rejection, or you're believing that people don't love you or don't like you, that's a trauma of perception. And that is absolutely going to impact the way that you respond to people around you. So if I think you're mad at me,
right,
and I'm perceiving that you're angry at me, I'm either going to tiptoe around you, or I'm not going to talk to you at all. I'm going to avoid you.
Mm-hmm.
You may not be mad at me at all. So the reality is you're not mad. I'm perceiving that you are. And so it's going to impact the way that I interact with you.
And what you don't know is I just had a terrible lunch. And so I come back to the office and I'm scowling.
Yeah.
And you see the scowl and you're saying, see, he's mad at me. But I haven't even thought of you because I just had this terrible lunch where I had this terrible news happen.
Yeah.
But our perception of reality, our emotions interpret our reality. That's very good.
Your brain is using your emotions to create a narrative.
Mm-hmm.
And so the narrative I'm telling myself is Jason's really upset at me.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know the context of what's actually been going on, but the narrative in my head is Jason's mad. And so if I don't go to you and talk about it, then I'm going to operate off of that narrative in my mind, which is a false narrative.
Right.
Because of my perception of what's going on. And I think this one's really important because this one, I think we tend to twist on God really easily. And, if something bad happens to us or we experience something difficult, a lot of times we can say, well, this happened because God's angry at me or God doesn't love me.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we know that's not true,
right.
But our perception is God's mad.
Mm-hmm.
God's very upset. And so for me, that's going to keep me from reaching out to him in prayer, from coming to him and unloading my burdens because he's angry at me. Why would I go to him?
Right.
And so that trauma of perception is going to keep me from the very thing that's going to heal or begin the healing process. But it's all because of how I'm perceiving God to be in this moment. And so that's traumatic and it impacts the way that I relate to God. It impacts the way I relate to other people. And so it just ripples throughout. And that's where we say, these things are traumatic and they matter because they do impact the way that we live our lives. And I think people, C and P, I think are more prevalent in our lives than most people want to admit, which is why I think it's important to expand the definition of what trauma is.
Yeah, I think everyone knows we compare and we have perceptions. I have never thought of them in the sense of, well, what if we were to group them as a trauma? In other words, a disruption of God's good intention and to be addressed formally like I would address traumas of absence and traumas of presence. Like I have never thought of putting them in that same area of solving or healing or processing.
Yeah.
I just thought of them over here as a sin I need to deal with,
Yeah.
And there's sin nature to it. But imagine if, when it becomes an overarching thought pattern and narrative that I can't interpret life without, that has become then a trauma.
Yeah.
And we're going to talk about that in what do we do now?
Yeah. And this trauma,
else to wind up the definition side.
Well, I would say the trauma C and especially trauma P are what got my antenna up from a coaching space, because when we say limiting beliefs, this is where those two occur. Yeah. My perception of I'm not good enough to have this, or I'm not capable of achieving that thing in my life. And so as I was talking to people, I got so frustrated because it felt like the issue was deeper than just the thought.
Right.
And then being introduced to Wilder and Warner's work, it was like, oh, here's a vocabulary for what's going on. I'm starting to see how it's playing out in my own life. And now it's informing the conversations I'm having with other people, because we're able to talk about what's actually going on, and you start to see light bulb moments for people going, oh, that's where that's coming from. And now that I know where it's coming from, I know how to impact it.
Right.
Instead of just thinking, well, this is just the way I think, it's just the way I'm wired. Not necessarily. And so when I'm struggling with perception issues, or I'm struggling with comparison issues, well then, now again, the diagnosis is there, for lack of a better term. And so now I know what to do. There's so much out there in terms of relational skills, and which we'll talk about later, but tools out there to help you process these things and be preventative. And so, but if we don't know what we're talking about, then we don't know how to use. If I don't know what a bolt is, then I don't know what tool to pick up to use.
Mm-hmm.
So,
okay. Well, this is excellent. So you've led us into a definition, and then you've invited us to consider the 4 types of trauma: absence, presence, comparison, perception. A, B, C, P. You're not very good with the alphabet.
yeah.
But anyway, we'll leave it at that. Twisting or disruption of God's good intention in our lives imposed on us, either from the sin nature or from others outside of us. Okay. What do we do about this? What do we do, Justin?
Yeah. So the first thing is, okay, now we've got a vocabulary for it. What's actually happening inside? And then how does that play on the outside? And so the way our brains work, and this is not just hokey science made to fit this framework, as they're mapping our brains and looking at emotions, this is what they're seeing.
Mm-hmm.
And so we always joke about being right-brained or left-brained. Well, you have both. So if you're listening today,
or neither.
You're walking around, you have both a left and a right brain. They might not be functioning as well as you'd like them to, but they're both there. But where trauma primarily impacts us is on the right side. And the right side is where our joy center is. And it's where our sense of identity comes from.
Okay, hang on.
Yeah.
Right side brain, joy center, sense of identity.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, keep going.
Yeah.
And just catching up.
Yeah. And so that's the right side of your brain. And the left side of your brain is where you have problem solving and kind of a logical response to things.
Okay.
The problem is your brain doesn't like send, okay, this is a problem, let me send it to the left-hand side, or this needs more feeling and this is an identity issue, let me send it to the right-hand side. The way your brain works is information always goes from the right to the left. Every piece of information that you filter goes through the right side of your brain first before it goes to the left.
So it never gets into the left unless it's gone through the right.
Yeah, it never gets to the left unless it's gone through the right side of your brain.
All right.
And so if the right side of your brain is where emotions and sense of identity are, and trauma impacts that, then before the left side of your brain, the logical side even has a chance to begin processing things. If the wires are crossed on the right side, the information getting to the left side is already filtered. And so a good example is going to be like a dog. Let's say you've had a horrible experience with a dog growing up.
Yeah.
And so
I did, by the way. A Doberman bit me as a kid.
That's awful.
That is awful.
I'm so sorry.
Well, my right side is all stunted.
It is. That explains a lot. But so you've had that bad experience with a dog. So your right side of your brain has filed away that experience to dogs equals bad or dogs equals scary. So now anytime you see a dog, because that file is in there and has not been processed or addressed, when the information comes in and the dog is in front of you, it goes through the right side of the brain. Well, the brain's going to say, okay, it's going to go through attachment, and then it's going to go through not just attachment, but it's going to go through the next step in the elevator, which is where it assigns kind of that fight or flight response.
Okay.
And so when we get there, it's going to pull that file. That your brain doesn't care. It's not there to judge whether it's right or wrong. It's just simply there to assess, is this a threat or not? Mm-hmm. And so when it goes, it's going to pull that file and it's going to go, dogs equals bad. Okay, well, I know what to do. There's no thinking involved. It's just, this is a problem. And so the elevator gets stuck at that level.
Right.
And so because the file it's pulled is fear, then what gets to the left-hand side of the brain is already filtered through fear. And so the left side of the brain is not thinking about, is this dog nice? Is it trying to lick me? Or is it trying to bite me? The left side of the brain goes, we've been told to run. How do we do it?
Right. So the problem solving on the left side is, how do I run?
Yeah. Not, is this actually a problem? Because the right side has already said, this is a problem. Get out of here.
Okay.
So, and this happens so quickly, which is why we say kind of precognitive or subconsciously. It happens before conscious thought can catch up to it, which is why when you see people with phobias,
that's happening on the right side.
We often wonder, why are you so, why can you not think logically right now?
Yeah.
Well, it's because you can't think logically because the elevator has stopped and hasn't gone all the way to the top in terms of processing the event in front of you. And so that's a really simple example, but that's what we say when trauma impacts our joy center or impacts our identity. Trauma impacts our ability for that elevator on the right side of our brain to get the information all the way to the left side for logic and processing.
So it sends it over, but it sends it over half baked because it stops at whatever floor.
Yeah.
That
It never got to what we'll talk about, attunement or identity. It stopped at this is a threat. And so it sends a code red.
Yeah.
And so it might be helpful to talk about the 4 stops on the elevator.
Okay, that's great. So we're in the right side of the brain, 4 stops on the elevator.
Yeah. And so the first one is attachment center. And these kind of, these steps on the elevator go with how your brain develops as you grow. And so the attachment center, that's the first floor.
Yep.
And that is all about relationships. So when a baby's born, they're just focused on a joyful attachment to their mother, their father. That's all they're focused on. So the greatest pleasure here is that joy of attachment to somebody. When we say joy, I'm glad to be with you. You are joy to me. And that's where sometimes that trauma of absence can occur if you're not getting that joyful response from somebody. And so then it moves up to the assessment center. And that's where we get fight or flight response.
Right.
This floor doesn't reason or change anything. That's not its job. Its job is simply to check the library and determine from past experience, is this a problem or is it not a problem? I think it's interesting in some of the reading I've been doing, when you have folks in PTSD, this is the floor the elevator gets stuck on. Everything's a fight or flight response.
Right.
Then you go to level 3, which so the third floor is the attunement center, and that's where you learn to attune to people's feelings. So how are they angry? Are they not angry? How angry are they? How sad are they? Is this an appropriate response? And when this floor is working, we don't feel isolated. We feel like we're connecting. We've attuned to other people. So I'm relating to you. I'm connected to you. And then the top floor, which is where we want everything to get to, is the identity center. Okay. And that's where we go, all right, what is it like for me to act here? What is it like for my people to act here? For the person that God wants me to be, how would they act in this moment? And so you can see if things don't get to that 4th floor, when it gets over to the left side of the brain, it's not fully processed everything. Right. So if it gets stuck at the 2nd floor, it's just going to be a fear response or a freeze response.
So all the information comes into us through the right hemisphere and it gets moved over ultimately to the left hemisphere to problem solve or to act on or to do or to, but it will get kicked over there depending which of the 4 levels our elevator can get to. And the first level is attachment, then assessment. Is this, it goes into the library. Is it afraid or is it a good thing? Then attunement, who's with me in this? Am I alone or do I have friends? And then identity, which is the 4th level, which is what is it like me to act? Okay. Now, these are the 4 levels on the right hemisphere that the joy elevator takes and then kicks over and wherever we get to. Okay. Let's stop right here and leave people on a cliffhanger.
All right. We'll leave them at the 2nd floor.
With the fear that they don't come back.
Yeah.
And let's come back next time and finish the story of what's going on in the right hemisphere and how it works with the left hemisphere, but then also move on to a whole different way to deal with these traumas that we have, which we haven't even talked about yet. So understanding how our brain works is the first way to deal with it. And then the second way to deal with it, we'll talk about again in the next podcast. So Justin, thank you so far for making me more confused.
Good.
Now you haven't. It's been super helpful, but comparison and perception, that was really helpful.
Yeah.
And what we'll do is we'll come back in the next episode and we will tackle the rest of the Joy Center and then the external way to deal with the traumas. This is all internal in our intracranium.
That's right, yeah.
Or intercranium, I don't know which of those.
Eventually it spills out, and that's what we can talk about.
And then it all spills out. Excellent. And a couple of even exercises or practices that we can begin to do right now. Not that will solve everything. All right, everybody, if you're still listening, you know Justin's a very smart guy and that I'm working to catch up, and that's a good thing. So join us the next time as we finish the job here on trauma is bigger than you think in that there's more of it out there, but it's smaller than you fear in that it doesn't have to define us. Thanks for being with us. Listen, who can you share this with right now that you can begin to bring hope to? A friend on the journey. Do that if you can, and we'll see you next time.
Sounds good.